Hello class, and welcome to our final week of CLS 100, week 10. And this week we take a detour from the classroom and into the world of financial literacy. So what does financial literacy have to do with your education? Everything. If you have money issues and you can't pay for school, you won't be able to get an education. Furthermore, navigating things like financial aid and loans can be daunting. So this week, we take a look at some aspects of financial literacy that will likely affect your life right now, as well as some that will have an impact in the future. We'll look at things like budgeting, credit cards, payday loans, and some various aspects of financial aid. So to begin with, in sort of a broad overview sense, financial literacy is understanding information about financial matters and being able to make appropriate decisions relative to financial areas such as real estate, student loans, taxes, and retirement. And overall, if you think of some sort of general suggestions, there are several things you can do to practice fiscal fitness. One thing that we know is that managing money can be a challenge for many students for a variety of reasons. Will you have to work to finance your education? Do you need to change your financial habits? The point is, regardless of your age, and I know that there is a wide range of ages and life stages and experience in our class, but regardless of your age, it's never too early to start practicing good financial habits. The information on this slide about young adults and debt is not in your textbook, but I wanted to include it because I think it's somewhat sobering to see this. And this sort of puts an exclamation point on why we talk about it in this class. So we know that nearly 50% of young adults have defaulted on a debt, 30% worry frequently about debt, 58% end up moving in with their parents after college, 22% altered their career plans due to debt. We know that the average credit card debt is now over $4,000, and that 24 to 40% of income is spent on debt payments. We also know that bankruptcy is a major issue for young adults. So if you need a reason for why we would talk about this topic in this class, this gives you some sense of why it's important. So as we think about financial literacy and preparing for your future and budgeting and things like that in general, there are a handful of things you can do that are sort of tips that are discussed in your textbook. The first one is practicing delayed gratification. It can be really tempting to want things right now, but when you're paying for your college education, oftentimes that means that you have to put some other things on hold to avoid getting into debt. Second will be take a personal finance course. Even if it's not something that's in your major, understanding personal finance is important. And it'll also help you learn the financial lingo. Make sure that you're savvy enough and understand the lingo well enough to be able to navigate personal finance. Another thing will be saving your change daily. It sounds small, but every little bit helps. And if you've ever grew up in a household that collected change, I remember several times when we would get down the coffee can that my dad would put his change in, and there would literally be sometimes hundreds of dollars in change. So don't waste anything. Next will be write down everything you spend. One of the activities that I have in the practice activities folder for this week involves doing that, writing down every cent you spend for 3 days just to have some sense of where your money goes. And then finally, one thing we're going to spend more time on is apply for all types of financial aid. So, if we look at the next slide, we can see some categories of financial aid. So loans are what they sound like, loans. They must be repaid with interest. Whereas grants are something that do not require repayment. And oftentimes grants are need-based, and you'll see several of those listed in your textbook. Scholarships also don't require repayment and are typically merit-based, but not always. And then work study is money that's earned while working on campus. So make sure that you look at all of those different options as you're looking at financial aid. So if you're applying for financial aid, and I realize that many of you have probably already done this, but maybe you haven't applied for all different types of aid, or maybe it was confusing when you did do it. So some basic tips would be completing your FAFSA in its entirety. It's extremely important to read the instructions carefully, attend to deadlines, and make sure the entire form is filled out. Be honest and supply any documentation required. It's never a good idea to be dishonest or to try to fool the federal government. Keep your tax returns and forms organized. That's a piece of advice that can follow you throughout your life, not just in terms of your FAFSA. Next will be work with financial aid officers on campus. They deal with this every day. They know sources of financial aid much better than you do. If you ever have questions or need help, that's the place to go. And finally, again, apply for all types of aid. So thinking about that, I want to talk briefly about one of the most common sources of financial aid, and that would be student loans. And the reality is that student loans are required for many college students. I remember when I was in school, I had several scholarships, but I still had student loans. Virtually all of us that I went to school with had student loans. I had work study, I had loans, and I had scholarships. And my parents were still paying some money out of pocket as well. College can be expensive. Even community college, as you all know, can be expensive. And so student loans are oftentimes a necessity. But if you are required to take out student loans, try to borrow only the minimum you need. Student loan debt can follow you for up to 30 years, and declaring bankruptcy does not relieve you of student debt. So be careful with your student debt. Don't take out excessive loans to pay for things that aren't related to your education, and try to exhaust other sources of aid first. Student loans should be the last thing that you look at. Okay, so now that we've talked a little bit about financial aid and student loans and some of those more college-related expenses, I want to spend the rest of our time talking about some sort of general financial literacy areas. The first of those is your credit score. It's extremely important that you protect your credit score or your FICO score. You need to monitor it at all times. And one of the things that you can do is to look at the tips on this slide, which give you some basic things you can do to protect your FICO score. The first tip is monitoring your credit report regularly, which is what I just said. Second will be to keep your credit card balances low. Third, ask your card companies for lower credit rates. Fourth, don't open multiple accounts at once. Fifth, keep the accounts that you have that are in good standing open. So if you have multiple accounts and you have some that are not in good standing, close those if you can, and make sure that the ones that are in good standing stay open. Those are the ones you want showing up on your credit report. Use automated payment systems for bills and keep your balance transfers to a minimum. If you look at page 269 in your textbook, figure 11.5 is an excellent reflection of the importance of your credit score. And what it does is this figure basically lays out the different interest rates that you might get with different ranges of credit scores if you were purchasing a home. And what you can see from that figure is that your interest rate can nearly double simply on the basis of your credit score. So if you think your credit score doesn't matter, or you hear stories about people who had terrible credit scores and still managed to get loans and things like that, it is true that that can happen, but it is extremely important to do everything you can to protect your credit score. It will make things go much smoother for you as you go through your life. Okay, the next area that we'll talk about briefly is budgeting. Budgeting is important because many of us have no idea how we actually spend our money. We sort of spend things as the days go on, and we don't really pay a lot of attention to where all of that money goes. The other thing that budgeting can do is it can help you identify exactly how much aid you need to finance your education, which is really the focus of some of the charts in the book. So on pages 271 and 272, there are a couple of tools there that can help you. Basically what those charts do is they give you a place to lay out the different areas of expense that you have. Things like household expenditures, phone and email costs, transportation, food, So as you kind of add all of those things up and you look at how much money you spend and how much money you need, you can get a sense of how much you will need then to borrow or to find through scholarships and grants to fund your education. So budgeting is an excellent habit to get into at any age. It's never too late to begin budgeting. Okay, for the next couple minutes, I want to talk about credit cards. And the reason we talk about credit card debt, there's sort of two major reasons. One of them is it's one of the worst kinds of debt you can have. And the second reason is that it's one of the most common forms of debt, especially among college students. Credit card issuers love college students. And what we know is that paying with plastic oftentimes results in more spending. There have been research studies on this. One of the things that's mentioned in your textbook is that when McDonald's began accepting credit cards, that they found that the average customer would spend $7 when paying with plastic versus spending only $4.50 if they were paying in cash. We also know that high interest and fees can add up quickly. It can become extremely difficult to get out of credit card debt once you're in, and it's because every month you end up with more interest piling on. So you may be making the minimum payments, and those minimum payments aren't doing anything to pay down that debt. So when you're looking at your credit cards, ask yourself, can you pay off what you spend each month? And if you can't, you probably need to get rid of those, or you need to look for less or ways to spend less money. There can be some advantages to using credit cards if you pay them off every month. If you have rewards cards, for example, you can accrue rewards from using those cards. But the key is you need to pay them off each month and not let debt pile up. Otherwise, those rewards end up costing you more than you get for them. So a few tips for managing credit cards. First of all, watch for changes in fees and interest rates. Credit card companies are notorious for changing things and then sending you some notice in the mail with a lot of fine print, so pay attention to those things. Also, be aware that your credit score can affect your rates. Third, avoid cards with annual fees. There are many cards out there with no annual fees, so don't get cards with annual fees. Next would be to know your grace periods and payment due dates, and keep track of those. That's why automatic payments and reminders can be helpful. Protect your card with a signature and CID. These are things that can help protect you against identity theft. Always try to make more than just minimum payments. Try debit cards instead, which are always backed by actual cash. Now, of course, the downfall of that is you can drain your checking account very quickly with your debit card. And then finally, if you find yourself in trouble, look for help. Seek reputable counseling. Okay. The next thing I want to look at very briefly is personal loans. You've probably seen these sort of payday loan places or kind of rent to own and things like that. You need to be extremely careful around those kinds of loans. Typically, they have extremely high interest rates and may be one of the only forms of debt that's actually worse than credit card debt. You have to read the fine print on these contracts because many of them can get you into serious financial trouble very quickly. One other thing that maybe you don't think about much is small item money drain. So what does that mean? Your book talks about something called the latte factor in figure 11.9 on page 277. And basically what that refers to is the idea that for some people, they may get one latte every morning at a coffee house. And when you start to add up that $3 a day, you realize that over the course of several years, it literally costs thousands of dollars. And so look at things like gum, bottled water, eating lunch out every day, buying junk food from vending machines, memberships that maybe you pay for and don't use, expensive salon treatments, cigarettes. These are all things that may be just a little bit at a time, but you do them so many times that it adds up to literally thousands of dollars over time. So as you look at your budgeting and you look at your finances, be very aware of what your small item money drain things are. What is your latte factor? Okay, the next thing we'll talk about is identity theft. You've probably heard things about identity theft already. It's something that is a widespread concern for college students. Either actual or virtual information may be stolen. The one thing that people may not know is oftentimes identity theft occurs by people that you know, acquaintances. It can occur by strangers as well. It's extremely time consuming and expensive to fix. And if you're looking for some tips for how to avoid identity theft, there are 2 pages of tips on 278 and 279 in your book that can be extremely helpful. So, in terms of looking at ways you can minimize your risk, carry only the necessary personal information. If you buy online, only use secured sites. Try not to use obvious passwords like your birthday. Memorize your PIN numbers and passwords. It's not a great idea to write them down. Don't write your PIN number for your debit card down on a piece of paper and put it in your wallet with your debit card. Shred your personal documents. You can buy a shredder fairly inexpensively. It's a great way to help protect yourself. Monitor your credit report. Protect your personal information online. And use a permanent mailing address. All right, the last thing that we'll look at is pages 279 through 282 in your textbook give you some concrete tips for dealing with some common pressures around finances. So what these pressures are is they involve things like needing to purchase a car, trying to save on fuel, feeling pressure to impulse buy something, having out of control grocery bills, dealing with situations where your kids want what other people have, or situations where your credit cards are lost or stolen. So if any of those things are problems for you, look in your textbook at the concrete tips and put them into practice. Okay, so in conclusion, our final topic reflection slide of the entire semester. With financial literacy, try to avoid the credit card trap. Budget and record how you spend your money. Monitor and protect your credit rating. Learn about the different types of financial aid. Don't borrow more money than you have to. Learn about investment and retirement plans. And get reliable counseling for debt management. That's it, the end of week 10, and that's the end of our lectures for CLS 100.